Let me read a letter I recently received.
This simple moment, one that seems not that noteworthy at first, is one of the single greatest moments in video game history. It accomplishes so much in such a small amount of time, and it has more subtlety than 90% of AAA games released nowadays. But to explain why this is such a good moment, we're gonna have to go back in time to 2004. 2004 was a pretty good year for video games. Halo 2 came out, San Andreas came out, and who could forget classics such as Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, the movie, the video game. 2004 was no joke. A lot of these games are fantastic, revered even to this day. But if you actually go back and play these games, they're very technologically limited. They don't hold up nowadays. What the games and their engines were capable of was nothing like what we have today. But Valve wanted to be the ones to push the boat out. They wanted to be the ones to revolutionize the gaming industry. Right before the release of Half-Life 2, Gabe Newell, the CEO of Valve, said this: "Why spend 4 years of your life building something that isn't innovative and is basically pointless? If Half-Life 2 isn't viewed as the best PC game of all time, it's going to completely bum out most of the guys on this team." This quote is from a GameSpot article by Jeff Keighley called The Final Hours of Half-Life 2, where Jeff went behind the scenes at Valve to learn about Half-Life's development. The article is a goldmine. It's a great way to see exactly what Valve's attitude towards the development of the game was at the time. The article does also compare Gabe's release of the first demo to the Second Iraq War that began in 2003. That's probably not a good look, Jeff. You might want to rewrite that bit. But this article, time and time again, shows us one thing and one thing only. Valve wanted to innovate, in a very similar way to modern Valve. And ever since they began working on Half-Life 2 back in 1999, this was their goal. And when Half-Life 2 finally released in 2004, it did not disappoint. It was critically acclaimed, and for good reason, because it was just as innovative as Gabe had promised. They built a whole new engine for Half-Life 2 called the Source engine that made very many changes to their old Gold Source engine that they'd previously been using. And this engine allowed them to do a whole bunch of groundbreaking things for the time with their graphics and their audio, and most importantly, their gameplay. Because one of the things so cleverly innovated upon was the physics system. Half-Life 2's physics system was absolutely insane for the time period. There was no other game on the market that had anything like it. Objects would not only react realistically in real time to the player's actions, but they could also be directly interacted with by the player as well. You could pick objects up and throw them and break them. Falling from a great height and landing on certain objects would cause those objects to break under your weight. You could even bash objects into NPCs' heads when you were bored in a cutscene.
Make your own way to Dr. Kleiner's lab.
We take this sort of thing for granted nowadays, but this was a huge feat to pull off at the time. The closest thing to this physics engine that any other game had was Halo 2, where certain objects had realistic physics, but you could never actually, interact with anything, or pick anything up, or break anything. It was great for the time, but it was still limited by the technology of the day. Half-Life 2 had you able to interact with basically any miscellaneous object laying around anywhere in the game. At first, you just pick up objects with your hands, but later on in the game, you get the gravity gun, which allows you to pick up even more objects that you couldn't before. And objects were destructible as well. If you hit a crate with a crowbar, it would break and fall apart into pieces. And those pieces would have their physics simulated just like any other object. And Valve loved to show off how cool their new tech was, so the game is full of interactable objects. Dr. Kleiner's lab is full to the brim of objects to throw around and mess with. There's even a mini teleporter in the corner that lets you teleport small physics objects from one place to another. Valve wanted you to see for yourself what they had pioneered and what it was capable of. But at the time, this was a very alien concept to a lot of people. There weren't any other games out there that had anywhere close to this level of freedom of what you can interact with. And a ton of Half-Life 2's puzzles and combat would rely on your interaction with the physics engine. There's a bunch of puzzles that force you to understand how objects would dynamically interact with each other in order to let you get past. And this could potentially become a roadblock. Valve were worried that their game was so innovative that it would actually alienate their player base. People were so used to the objects in the games they play being just completely uninteractable. They're either props in the background that don't have physics at all, or they can only be moved by set pieces and cutscenes. So Valve needed a way to teach players that this physics system was not only in the game, but was actually important, and was something that the player should be incentivized to use. And the way they did this is this little moment right here. You might not have known it when you first played the game, but this moment here is a tutorial. Right before this moment takes place, another character tells you to pile up some objects and climb out of a window. The game tells you to press E to pick up objects, and you then use those objects to do as you were told. But then in the very next room after that, this moment happens. You literally just learned how to pick up objects, and the game very cleverly lets you know that you can also throw objects. So of course, that's what most people probably do. And that's all the game needed to teach you how to interact with physics objects. This tiny little miniature invisible tutorial will allow you to solve all of the puzzles that come ahead that require these interactions. It's extremely simple and elegant. It doesn't need to pop up an obnoxious text box that pauses gameplay to tell you about the mechanic in a wall of text. Or do what Dead Space does and make sure that you really understand that you need to cut off their limbs.
Shoot the limbs off enemies for extra damage.
Shooting them in the body didn't seem to work.
Forget about shooting them in the body. You gotta cut off the limbs.
You have to dismember the creatures to stop them.
Shoot for the limbs.
Really subtle, Dead Space, thank you. It doesn't need to be so hands-on because it knows exactly how to teach you its mechanics without insulting your intelligence. And this is not the only example of this in Half-Life 2. When you first arrive at Ravenholm, there's this zombie torso stuck in the wall by a saw blade. A couple of other saw blades actually block the door, so you're forced to move them if you want to pass through. The instant you do that, a zombie walks around this corner, which sets up the perfect intuitive moment for the player to do this. When you're first introduced to the gravity gun, you're given this playground of objects to toss around and see how the weapon works. This is the most formal tutorial in the entire game, but it's still better than these dialogue boxes because it's done diegetically. It's a character in the world telling you how something works organically. You even get to play catch with the big robot dog. There's also the way that the game introduces these barnacle enemies. These enemies are static and they stick to the ceiling areas throughout the game. They don't move, but if you walk into their tongue, they can pull you up and try and eat you. And this is how those enemies are introduced. It doesn't need to be so intrusive or so on the nose, because it doesn't think that its players are idiots. All of this is an incredible lesson in game design that modern games still try to follow, or at least good modern games do anyway. So that is why this simple moment of an NPC asking the player to do a task is one of the best moments in video game history. Thanks for watching.